Some days begin with a quiet unease you can't quite name. A small thought slips in, then lingers a little too long. And before you notice it, the weight of it tilts the whole morning off balance. A pause here, just to feel the pull. It's strange how a single thought can steer the day without asking for permission. It rises, it presses, it repeats itself. The mind echoes it until it feels heavier than it actually is. And the hours follow its rhythm. The mood bends around it. The body tightens because of it. Yet it started as nothing more than a flicker, a whisper, a line in the mind that grew louder simply because it wasn't questioned. Sometimes that's all it takes. Just one loose thread. They once understood that a thought isn't a fact. It never was. It's only a possibility dressed as certainty. And yet, it speaks with the confidence of something undeniable. It insists. It paints the worst angles first. It pushes itself forward as truth, even when it's only a guess shaped by old fears or tired habits. There's a quiet freedom in remembering this, a shift so small it's easy to miss. When a thought rises, there's a moment, thin as breath, where reaction hasn't formed yet. If that moment is noticed, the grip loosens. If it's missed, the thought fills the space and becomes the weather of the mind. So the work begins in that fragile distance, watching the thought arrive without letting it take the wheel, letting it speak, but not letting it lead, just observing, nothing more. And with that observation, a space opens, a step back, a soft uncoupling between you and the noise. The thought loses its urgency when it's held at arm's length. It becomes something separate, something moving past rather than moving through. Its edge dulls. Its claim over you weakens. The pulse slows because the mind is no longer tangled in the words it created. A simple distance, but it changes everything. This distance grows with small moments of awareness. Not grand attempts, not dramatic breakthroughs, just a steady noticing, again and again, when the mind drifts into patterns that drain more than they give. The recognition becomes familiar. The tension becomes easier to spot. The release becomes more natural, almost instinctive, and the day feels lighter because the inner clutter doesn't pile up the way it used to. A gentle clearing, repeated daily. Over time, this awareness becomes a quiet habit, a way of meeting whatever thought appears without surrendering to it, a way of letting the unhelpful pass without holding on. The mind doesn't become silent, but it becomes navigable, more spacious, more steady. And the thoughts that once pushed the whole day off course lose their authority. Just thoughts. Only that. There's a moment that appears before any word leaves the mouth. A small pause, barely noticeable. Yet it reveals more than the entire sentence that follows. It's the space where the ego usually tries to rush in, eager to fill the air. And watching that impulse rise becomes its own quiet lesson. Sometimes the act of saying less feels like a subtle rebellion. A steady refusal to let pride take the lead. A soft resistance. And it lands with more weight than any loud reply could offer. There's a different kind of clarity in people who speak by intention, not by habit. You can see it in the way they take a breath before answering. In the way their eyes settle, as if measuring what truly needs to be said. Their words arrive slowly, shaped by choice, not by urgency. Not by discomfort, just choice. And in that measured rhythm, something inside them stays unshaken. A reminder that speaking is never a requirement, only an option. There are moments when speaking feels easy, simply because silence feels heavy. Moments when filling the space seems like the simplest escape. Yet the real task lies in choosing. choosing whether a thought deserves sound, choosing whether the moment actually needs a voice, choosing whether restraint might serve better than expression. That choice creates a boundary inside, a boundary that steadies the mind, a boundary that reminds, not every impulse earns a path outward. Hold back when the moment calls for it. Let the quiet land. Let it settle. Silence has its own presence. It gathers the mind, pulls scattered attention back into one place. In the absence of constant speaking, thoughts stop tumbling over one another. Breathing becomes easier. Awareness sharpens. There's a sense of finally arriving in the moment that was already here. Still, unaffected, unrushed. And that simple stillness becomes its own kind of anchor, a place to return to whenever the world feels too loud. Then comes the deeper work, noticing the spark before the word, the quick tightening in the chest, the sudden urge to reply, explain, defend, justify. That impulse is where the real decision happens. Control that, and the rest follows. Let it run unchecked, and the mouth becomes its echo. A quiet mind begins long before the voice goes quiet. It starts by holding the reins on that first surge of reaction. Just a breath, just a pause, enough to shift the entire tone of what comes next. In the end, restraint isn't about silence for its own sake. It's about presence, a steady return to the self before the world pulls a response out too quickly. A reminder that words carry weight, and weight deserves intention. So the space before speaking becomes a place to stand, calm, settled, certain enough to say only what truly needs to be said, and nothing more. It's unsettling to admit how easily the mind slips into automatic reactions, how quickly the moment takes over, how fast you let the world decide for you. And yet, the quiet truth stands there, unshaken. The response is still yours, even when tired, even when overwhelmed. A small pause is enough to see it, a reminder that nothing forces you to move in the direction of your first impulse, that you can redirect yourself, even slightly, and shift the entire weight of the situation. The power feels distant at first, almost theoretical, but it's there, waiting for you to claim it. There's a subtle divide in each day, a thin line between what bends to your will and what refuses to move no matter how hard you push. The mind blurs that line when emotions run high. It convinces you everything must be wrestled with, fixed, solved immediately. But clarity arrives when you stop fighting every shadow. Some things are simply not yours to carry. And the moment that becomes obvious, pressure loosens. Breathing becomes easier. Control feels lighter, more precise. And the noise around you loses its authority. Then comes the quiet decision to reclaim ground you once gave away. Not with force, not with dramatic change, just the steady return to what you can actually influence. A gentle tightening of focus, a willingness to act on the small things that still respond to your effort. And from there, a sense of direction builds again. You move differently when you stop chasing what won't change. You walk straighter when your energy finally has a place to land. That shift, though small, restores a kind of inner ownership you forgot you had. There is a strength that forms when you see things as they are. Not harsher, not softer, just clear. And clarity has a strange way of sharpening the edges of your resolve. It trims unnecessary worry. It reduces the urge to explain yourself. It strips away the weight of imagined scenarios. With focus, you become harder to shake. Distractions lose their pull. Noise loses its bite. You stop scattering your attention on things that dissolve in your hands. And for a brief moment, everything aligns in a straight line. Somewhere beneath all of this, the inner world keeps forming its own weather. Thoughts drift in, some heavy, some restless, some accusing. They try to define the mood of the entire day before it even starts. But the quality of those thoughts determines more than the world outside ever could. A brighter thought steadies you. A grounded thought anchors you. A calm thought changes the temperature of everything you touch. And when the inner climate shifts, the outer noise feels smaller. What once felt like a storm becomes something you can walk through. One clear thought at a time. One breath. Enough. The mind drifts more easily than it holds its ground. An analytical look at that drift reveals something simple. Attention always seeks a direction, even when no direction is chosen. And when it's left unchecked, it spirals into places that drain strength instead of building it. So the quiet task becomes choosing where that stream goes, nudging it toward what steadies you, toward what lifts rather than weighs. It's a slow redirection, sometimes subtle, sometimes tiring. But each shift shapes the inner space you stand on. A small reminder. Attention is not fixed. It becomes clear how often the gaze turns backward without noticing. A quiet pull into old frustrations, old mistakes, old moments that can no longer answer back. There is a heaviness in looking behind too long. As if the body wants to move, but the mind holds its feet to the ground. Nothing grows in that posture. The past stays still. Yet the pull feels familiar, almost comforting in its own way. Only when the weight becomes obvious does the necessity appear to face forward again. One small turn, one breath that releases the old grip. Forward is the only direction that moves. The present waits patiently. It never argues, never insists, never begs for attention. It simply exists, steady and unchanging, holding the only space where anything can actually shift. And still, it's the one place the mind escapes from most. There's a calm in noticing this escape, a chance to return without drama, without guilt, just a quiet stepping back into the only moment that listens. Here, only here. There is something almost mechanical about discipline. Not grand, not fierce, just the repetition of returning the mind when it wanders. Over and over. The return builds more than the arrival. Each pullback feels small, almost meaningless on its own. But the accumulation becomes a structure inside, a steadiness that wasn't there before. And in that steadying, the noise loses some of its power. Come back, just that. Negative emotions rise like signals, sudden, sharp, often uncomfortable. But they don't demand interpretation. They point. They show tension, show where the mind is clinging, show what needs loosening. Not to tighten further, not to feed the spiral, but to release what's no longer useful. The feeling becomes a cue to let go, not a story to chase. With each release, something inside gets lighter. Not dramatically, just enough to breathe differently. Let it fall away. Pain rises first in the mind, long before it settles anywhere else. A shift in how something is seen can soften what felt unbearable a moment ago. The weight changes when the lens changes. And sometimes, the heaviness fades simply because the mind no longer feeds it. Quiet adjustments, subtle, enough to breathe again, enough to stand still and not collapse under what once felt sharp. Even a small shift matters, even a brief pause, enough. Acceptance comes later, when the struggle finally loses its energy, when the push against what already happened feels pointless. The moment the fight stops, a kind of calm opens. Not triumphant, just steady. Like a door that was always there but only now becomes visible. There is no need to win against the past, no need to wrestle with what refuses to move. Acceptance is not surrender. It is the release of a burden that was never meant to be dragged so far. A pause, a breath, stillness. Freedom begins quietly, often in the space where pretending ends. When the need for approval dissolves, even slightly, something inside loosens. The tension to fit, to please, to mold yourself into shapes that never felt natural. It all thins out, and the self that was muted comes forward, not loudly, but with a steady pulse. Permission is no longer borrowed from anyone. It comes from within, simple and undramatic. A small truth repeating itself in the background, enough to anchor you. Enough. The way you see yourself becomes the only ground that does not shift under influence. The world throws its opinions like passing weather, changing, inconsistent, often careless. But the inner view, when kept honest and uncluttered, stays firm. That clarity guards against distortion. It keeps you from chasing reflections that do not belong to you. A quiet reminder rises from within. Hold your own image gently but firmly. Let external noise fade. Let the mind return to a steadier place. Hold, then hold again. The past remains what it is, yet it offers something raw to work with. Not a chain, not a sentence, just material. Rough, uneven, but usable. In the right hands, the hands you have now, not the ones from before, it becomes something else. A foundation, a tool, a shape that supports rather than limits. You don't have to glorify it or erase it. Just pick up what can be used and leave the rest behind. Lightly, quietly, with a sense of forward motion that doesn't need to rush. Enough to continue. Enough to grow into what comes next. It feels strange how silence waits at the edge of everything. Almost unnoticed, almost forgotten. Yet the moment it reaches you, something inside loosens. As if the world stops pressing for an answer. As if the noise finally steps back. Silence becomes a shelter you didn't know you were missing. A place where nothing demands your attention. A place where the constant pull of stimulation fades just enough for you to breathe again. And in that small release, a quiet truth surfaces. You needed this more than you admitted. You always did. Then another layer appears. In silence, the mind stops hiding. Thoughts come up without disguises, without their usual speed. Feelings rise in shapes you can finally understand. Not louder, just clearer. And for a moment, the noise inside aligns with the quiet outside. It's unsettling, but grounding. A brief reminder that there is a voice you've been ignoring. Your own. A voice that only speaks when everything else goes still. A voice that rarely shouts, yet it's the one that carries weight. As the quiet deepens, a question emerges. Soft, but persistent. Are you actually moving in the direction you think you are? The silence doesn't give answers. It only removes the excuses you usually hide behind. It leaves you with the raw shape of your choices. And in that space, a simple thought settles in your chest. Maybe the path you're on needs to be looked at again. Maybe you already knew that. A pause, a breath. Stillness asking for honesty. But silence doesn't stop there. It presses a little deeper. It shows the truths you tend to slide past. The ones you postpone. The ones you soften. In quiet, they lose their blur. You see the habits that drain you, the patterns you let repeat, the hesitations you dress up as caution. Hard truths, stripped of decoration. Not cruel, just unfiltered. And the weight they carry is strangely steadying, because facing them is the first moment you stop running. And from that steadiness, something shifts. A pull toward more quiet, not to escape life, but to re-enter it with your eyes open. Silence becomes a way back to what matters, A way back to the parts of you that get buried under urgency and noise. A way back to the decisions that feel like yours. So you chase it. Not desperately, not constantly, just enough. Enough to hear yourself again. Enough to recognize what you've been missing. Enough to remember the direction that feels true. Sometimes it's noticeable how quickly words escape when the mind isn't fully present. A rush, a slip, a reaction that felt small in the moment but leaves a faint trace afterward. There's a quiet tension in seeing how easily damage forms, not from intention, but from the lack of awareness before the tongue moves. And that awareness, once absent, lingers as a kind of aftertaste, a reminder of how fragile the space is between thought and impact, how thin the line is between expression and consequence. There's a certain presence in someone who knows how to hold their voice, not forced silence, not avoidance, just a steady sense of timing. A person who doesn't rush to fill the air feels different. Their calm draws the attention that noise never could. Even their pauses feel deliberate, as if they're listening to something beneath the surface. And that restraint has a weight of its own. Talking less shifts something inside. There's more room to sense the direction of things, more air to breathe before choosing a path. The mind settles a bit when it isn't busy chasing every impulse that tries to push through the mouth. And in that settling, control doesn't feel like a battle anymore. It becomes quieter, clearer, a small center of gravity returning to its place. A simple pause before speaking changes the entire texture of a moment. One breath, one beat, just enough space to notice what rises inside and decide whether it deserves to be given shape. That small delay softens the urgency that usually takes over. And in that softness, a calmer response appears. Not perfect, just steadier. There's a subtle art in mastering the gap between trigger and response. A private space, almost hidden, where everything shifts. The world still moves at its usual speed, but something inside slows just enough to see what's happening without being dragged by it. That gap becomes a kind of refuge, a quiet room within the noise, and from there, the next move forms on its own.